In the autumn of the year, biding his hour, Morgoth loosed upon the people of Narog the great host that he had long prepared. And Glaurung the Uruloki passed over Anfauglith, and came thence into the north vales of Sirion, and there did great evil. Under the shadows of Eredwethrin, he defiled the Aethel Ivrin, and thence he passed into the realm of Nargothrond, and burned the Talath Dirnan, the guarded plain between Narog and Teglin. Then the warriors of Nargothrond went forth, and tall and terrible on that day looked Turin, and the heart of the host was upheld, as he rode on the right hand of Orodreth. But greater far was the host of Morgoth than any scouts had told, and none but Turin, defended by his dwarf mask, could withstand the approach of Glaurung. And the elves were driven back and pressed by the orcs into the field of Tumhalad, between Ginglith and Narog, and there they were penned. On that day, all the pride and host of Nargothrond withered away. And Orodreth was slain in the forefront of the battle, and Gwyndor, son of Gwilyn, was wounded to the death. But Turin came to his aid, and all fled before him, and he bore Gwyndor out of the rout, and escaping into a wood, there laid him on the grass. Then Gwyndor said to Turin, "Let bearing pay for bearing. But ill-fated was mine, and vain is thine. For my body is marred beyond healing, and I must leave Middle-earth. And though I love thee, son of Húrin, yet I rue the day that I took thee from the orcs. But for thy prowess and thy pride, still I should have love and life, and Nargothrond should yet stand a while. Now if thou love me, leave me. Haste thee to Nargothrond, and save Finduilas, and this last I say to thee, she alone stands between thee and thy doom. If thou fail her, it shall not fail to find thee. Farewell." Then Turin sped back to Nargothrond, mustering such of the rout as he met with on the way, and the leaves fell from the trees in a great wind as they went, for the autumn was passing to a dire winter. But the host of the orcs and Glaurung the dragon were there before him, and they came suddenly, ere those that were left on guard were aware of what had befallen on the field of Tumhalad. In that day the bridge over Narog proved an evil, for it was great and mightily made, and could not swiftly be destroyed, and the enemy came readily over the deep river, and Glaurung came in full fire against the doors of Felagund, and overthrew them, and passed within. And even as Turin came up, the dreadful sack of Nargothrond was well nigh achieved. The orcs had slain or driven off all that remained in arms, and were even then ransacking the great halls and chambers, plundering and destroying. But those of the women and maidens that were not burned or slain, they had herded on the terraces before the doors, as slaves to be taken into Morgoth's thraldom. Upon this ruin and woe Turin came, and none could withstand him, or would not, though he struck down all before him, and passed over the bridge, and hewed his way towards the captives. And now he stood alone, for the few that followed him had fled. But in that moment Glaurung issued from the gaping doors, and lay behind between Turin and the bridge. Then suddenly he spoke by the evil spirit that was in him, saying, "Hail, son of Húrin! Well met." Then Turin sprang about, and strode against him, and the edges of Gurthang shone as with flame. But Glaurung withheld his blast, and opened wide his serpent eyes, and gazed upon Turin. Without fear, Turin looked into them, as he raised up the sword, and straightway he fell under the binding spell of the lidless eyes of the dragon, and was halted moveless. Then for a long time he stood as one graven of stone, and they too were alone, silent before the doors of Nargothrond. But Glaurung spoke again, taunting Turin, and he said, "Evil have been all thy ways, son of Húrin. Thankless fosterling, outlaw, slayer of thy friend, thief of love,
usurper of Nargothrond, captain foolhardy and deserter of thy kin. As thralls thy mother and thy sister live in Dorlomin, in misery and want. Thou art arrayed as a prince, but they go in rags. And for thee they yearn. But thou carest not for that. Glad may thy father be to learn that he hath such a son, as learn he shall.
And Turin, being under the spell of Glaurung, hearkened to his words, and he saw himself as in a mirror misshapen by malice, and loathed that which he saw. And while he was yet held by the eyes of the dragon in torment of mind, and could not stir, the orcs drove away the herded captives, and they passed nigh to Turin, and crossed over the bridge. Among them was Finduilas, and she cried out to Turin as she went. But not until her cries and the wailing of the captives was lost upon the northward road did Glaurung release Turin, and he might not stop his ears against that voice that haunted him after. Then suddenly Glaurung withdrew his glance and waited, and Turin stirred slowly as one waking from a hideous dream. Then coming to himself, he sprang upon the dragon with a cry. But Glaurung laughed, saying,
If thou wilt be slain, I will slay thee gladly. But small help will that be to Morwen and Nienor. No heed didst thou give to the cries of the elf woman. Wilt thou deny also the bond of thy blood?
But Turin, drawing back his sword, stabbed at the dragon's eyes, and Glaurung, coiling back swiftly, towered above him and said,
Nay, at least thou art valiant, beyond all whom I have met. And they lie who say that we, of our part, do not honor the valor of foes. See now, I offer thee freedom. Go to thy kin if thou canst. Get thee gone. And if elf or man be left to make tale of these days, then surely in scorn they will name thee, if thou spurnest this gift.
Then Turin, being yet bemused by the eyes of the dragon, as were he treating with a foe that could know pity, believed the words of Glaurung, and turning away he sped over the bridge. But as he went, Glaurung spoke behind him, saying in a fell voice,
Haste thee now, son of Húrin, to Dorlomin, or perhaps the orcs shall come before thee once again. And if thou tarry for Finduilas, then never shalt thou see Morwen again, and never at all shalt thou see Nienor thy sister, and they will curse thee.
But Turin passed away on the northward road, and Glaurung laughed once more, for he had accomplished the errand of his master. Then he turned to his own pleasure, and sent forth his blast, and burned all about him. But all the orcs that were busy in the sack he routed forth, and drove them away, and denied them their plunder, even to the last thing of worth. The bridge then he broke down, and cast into the foam of Narog, and being thus secure, he gathered all the hoard and riches of Felagund, and heaped them, and lay upon them in the innermost hall, and rested a while. And Turin hastened along the ways to the north, through the lands now desolate, between Narog and Teglin, and the fell winter came down to meet him. For in that year snow fell ere autumn was past, and spring came late and cold. Ever it seemed to him as he went, that he heard the cries of Finduilas, calling his name by wood and hill, and great was his anguish. But his heart being hot with the lies of Glaurung, and seeing ever in his mind the orcs burning the house of Húrin, or putting Morwen and Nienor to torment, he held on his way, and turned never aside. At last, worn by haste and the long road, for 40 leagues and more had he journeyed without rest, he came with the first ice of winter to the pools of Ivrin, where before he had been healed. But they were now but a frozen mire, and he could drink there no more. Thus he came hardly by the passes of Dorlomin, through bitter snows from the north, and found again the land of his childhood. Bare and bleak it was, and Morwen was gone. Her house stood empty, broken, and cold, and no living thing dwelt nigh. Therefore Turin departed, and came to the house of Brodda the Easterling, he that had to wife Earin, Hurin's kinswoman. And there he learned of an old servant that Morwen was long gone, for she had fled with Nienor out of Dordlomen. None but Earin knew where. Then Turin strode to Brodda's table, and seizing him, he drew his sword, and demanded that he be told whither Morwen had gone. And Earin declared to him that she went to Doriath to seek her son. For the lands were freed then from evil, she said, by the black sword of the south, who now has fallen, they say. Then Turin's eyes were opened, and the last threads of Glaurung's spell were loosed. And for anguish and wrath at the lies that had deluded him, and hatred of the oppressors of Morwen, a black rage seized him, and he slew Brodda in his hall, and other Easterlings that were his guests. Thereafter he fled out into the winter, a hunted man. But he was aided by some that remained of Hador's people, and knew the ways of the wild, and with them he escaped through the falling snow, and came to an outlaw's refuge in the southern mountains of Dordlomen. Thence Turin passed again from the land of his childhood, and returned to Sirion's vale. His heart was bitter, for to Dordlomen he had brought only greater woe upon the remnants of his people, and they were glad of his going. And this comfort alone he had, that by the prowess of the black sword the ways to Doriath had been laid open to Morwen. And he said in his thought, then those deeds wrought not evil to all. And where else might I have better bestowed my kin, even had I come sooner? For if the girdle of Melian be broken, then last hope is ended. Nay, it is better indeed as things be. For a shadow I cast wheresoever I come. Let Melian keep them, and I will leave them in peace, unshadowed for a while. Now Turin, coming down from Eredwethrin, sought for Findwilas in vain, roaming the woods beneath the mountains, wild and wary as a beast, and he waylaid all the roads that went north to the pass of Sirion. But he was too late, for all the trails had grown old, or were washed away by the winter. Yet thus it was that, passing southwards down Teglin, Turin came upon some of the men of Brethil that were surrounded by orcs, and he delivered them, for the orcs fled from Gurthang. He named himself Wild Man of the Woods, and they besought him to come and dwell with them. But he said that he had an errand yet unachieved, to seek Findwilas, Orodreth's daughter of Nargothrond. Then Dorlas, the leader of those woodmen, told the grievous tidings of her death. For the men of Brethil had waylaid at the crossings of Teglin the orc host that led the captives of Nargothrond, hoping to rescue them. But the orcs had at once cruelly slain their prisoners, and Findwilas they pinned to a tree with a spear. So she died, saying at the last, "Tell the Mormagil that Findwilas is here." Therefore they had laid her in a mound near that place, and named it Hauth in Eleth, the mound of the elf-maid. Turin bade them lead him thither, and there he fell down into a darkness of grief that was near death. Then Dorlas, by his black sword, the fame whereof had come even into the deeps of Brethil, and by his quest of the king's daughter, knew that this wild man was indeed the Mormagil of Nargothrond, whom rumour said was the son of Hurin of Dordlomen. Therefore the woodmen lifted him up and bore him away to their homes. Now those were set in a stockade upon a high place in the forest Ethel Brandir upon Ammon Ober. For the people of Haleth were now dwindled by war, and Brandir, son of Handir, who ruled them, was a man of gentle mood, and lame also from childhood, and he trusted rather in secrecy than in deeds of war to save them from the power of the north. Therefore he feared the tidings that Dorlas brought, and when he beheld the face of Turin as he lay on the bier, a cloud of foreboding lay on his heart. Nonetheless, being moved by his woe, he took him into his own house, and tended him, for he had skill in healing. And with the beginning of spring, Turin cast off his darkness, and grew hale again. And he arose, and he thought that he would remain in Brethil hidden, and put his shadow behind him, forsaking the past. He took therefore a new name, Turambar, which in the high elven speech signified Master of Doom. And he besought the woodmen to forget that he was a stranger among them, or ever bore any other name. Nonetheless, he would not wholly leave deeds of war, for he could not. Now new tidings came to Doriath concerning Nargothrond, for some that had escaped from the defeat and the sack, and had survived the fell winter in the wild, came at last to Thingol seeking refuge. And the march wardens brought them to the king. And some said that all the enemy had withdrawn northwards, and others that Glaurung abode still in the halls of Felagund. And some said that the Mormegil was slain, and others that he was cast under a spell by the dragon, and dwelt there yet, as one changed to stone. But all declared that it was known to many in Nargothrond ere the end, that the Mormegil was none other than Turin, son of Hurin, of Dorlomin. Then Morwen was distraught, and refusing the counsel of Melian, she rode forth alone into the wild to seek her son, or some true tidings of him. Thingol therefore sent Mablung after her, with many hardy march wards, to find her and guard her, and to learn what news they might. But Nienor was bidden to remain behind. Yet the fearlessness of her house was hers, and in an evil hour, in hope that Morwen would return when she saw that her daughter would go with her into peril, Nienor disguised herself as one of Thingol's people, and went with that ill-fated riding. They came upon Morwen by the banks of Sirion, and Mablung besought her to return to Menegroth. But she was fey, and would not be persuaded. Then also the coming of Nienor was revealed, and despite Morwen's command, she would not go back. And Mablung perforce brought them to the hidden ferries at the Meres of Twilight, and they passed over Sirion. And after 3 days' journeying, they came to Amon Ethir, the Hill of Spies, that long ago Felagund had caused to be raised with great labor, a league before the doors of Nargothrond. There Mablung set a guard of riders about Morwen and her daughter, and forbade them to go further. But he, seeing from the hill no sign of any enemy, went down with his scouts to the Narog, as stealthily as they could go. But Glaurung was aware of all that they did, and he came forth in heat of wrath, and lay into the river, and a vast vapor and a foul reek went up, in which Mablung and his company were blinded and lost. Then Glaurung passed east over Narog. Seeing the onset of the dragon, the guards upon Amon Ethir sought to lead Morwen and Nienor away, and fly with them with all speed back eastwards. But the wind bore the blank mists upon them, and their horses were maddened by the dragon stench, and were ungovernable, and ran this way and that, so that some were dashed against trees and were slain, and others were borne far away. Thus the ladies were lost, and of Morwen indeed no sure tidings came ever to Doriath after. But Nienor, being thrown by her steed, yet unhurt, made her way back to Amon Ethir, there to await Mablung, and came thus above the reek into the sunlight. And looking westward, she stared straight into the eyes of Glaurung, whose head lay upon the hilltop. Her will strove with him for a while, but he put forth his power, and having learned who she was, he constrained her to gaze into his eyes, and he laid a spell of utter darkness and forgetfulness upon her, so that she could remember nothing that had ever befallen her, nor her own name, nor the name of any other thing. And for many days she could neither hear nor see, nor stir by her own will. Then Glaurung left her standing alone upon Amon Ethir, and went back to Nargothrond. Now Mablung, who greatly daring had explored the halls of Felagund when Glaurung left them, fled from them at the approach of the dragon, and returned to Amon Ethir. The sun sank and night fell as he climbed the hill, and he found none there save Nienor, standing alone under the stars as an image of stone. No word she spoke or heard, but would follow if he took up her hand. Therefore, in great grief, he led her away, though it seemed to him vain, for they were both like to perish, succorless, in the wild. But they were found by 3 of Mablung's companions, and slowly they journeyed northward and eastward towards the fences of the land of Doriath beyond Sirion, and the guarded bridge nigh to the inflowing of Esgalduin. Slowly the strength of Nienor returned as they drew nearer to Doriath, but still she could not speak or hear, and walked blindly as she was led. But even as they drew near the fences, at last she closed her staring eyes and would sleep. And they laid her down and rested also unheedfully, for they were utterly outworn. There they were assailed by an orc band, such as now roamed often as nigh the fences of Doriath as they dared. But Nienor in that hour recovered hearing and sight, and being awakened by the cries of the orcs, she sprang up in terror and fled ere they could come to her. Then the orcs gave chase, and the elves after, and they overtook the orcs and slew them ere they could harm her. But Nienor escaped them, for she fled as in a madness of fear, swifter than a deer, and tore off all her clothing as she ran, until she was naked. And she passed out of their sight, running northward. And though they sought her long, they found her not, nor any trace of her. And at last Mablung, in despair, returned to Menegroth and told the tidings. Then Thingol and Melian were filled with grief. But Mablung went forth, and sought long in vain for tidings of Morwen and Nienor. But Nienor ran on into the woods until she was spent, and then fell and slept and awoke. And it was a sunlit morning, and she rejoiced in light as it were a new thing, and all things else that she saw seemed new and strange, for she had no names for them. Nothing did she remember, save a darkness that lay behind her, and a shadow of fear. Therefore she went warily as a hunted beast, and became famished, for she had no food and knew not how to seek it. But coming at last to the crossings of Teglin, she passed over, seeking the shelter of the great trees of Brethil, for she was afraid, and it seemed to her that the darkness was overtaking her again, from which she had fled. But it was a great storm of thunder that came up from the south, and in terror she cast herself down upon the mound of Hauth en Eleth, stopping her ears from the thunder. But the rain smote her and drenched her, and she lay like a wild beast that is dying. There Turambar found her, as he came to the crossings of Teglin, having heard rumor of orcs that roamed near, and seeing in a flare of lightning the body, as it seemed, of a slain maiden lying upon the mound of Findwilas, he was stricken to the heart. But the woodmen lifted her up, and Turambar cast his cloak about her, and they took her to a lodge nearby, and warmed her and gave her food. And as soon as she looked upon Turambar, she was comforted, for it seemed to her that she had found at last something that she had sought in her darkness, and she would not be parted from him. But when he asked her concerning her name and her kin and her misadventure, then she became troubled as a child that perceives that something is demanded but cannot understand what it may be, and she wept. Therefore Turambar said, "Do not be troubled. The tale shall wait. But I will give you a name, and I will call you Niniel, Tear Maiden." And at that name she shook her head and said, "Niniel." That was the first word she spoke after her darkness, and it remained her name among the woodmen ever after. On the next day they bore her towards Efel Brandir. But when they came to Dimrost, the rainy stair, where the tumbling stream of Celebros fell towards Teglin, a great shuddering came upon her, wherefore afterwards that place was called Nen Girith, the shuddering water. Ere she came to the home of the woodmen upon Ammon Obel, she was sick of a fever, and long she lay thus, tended by the women of Brethil, and they taught her language as to an infant. But ere the autumn came, by the skill of Brandir, she was healed of her sickness, and she could speak. But nothing did she remember of the time before she was found by Turambar on the mound of Hauth en Eleth. And Brandir loved her, but all her heart was given to Turambar. In that time, the woodmen were not troubled by the orcs, and Turambar went not to war, and there was peace in Brethil. His heart turned to Niniel, and he asked her in marriage. But for that time she delayed in spite of her love. For Brandir foreboded he knew not what, and sought to restrain her, rather for her sake than his own, or rivalry with Turambar. And he revealed to her that Turambar was Turin son of Hurin, and though she knew not the name, a shadow fell upon her mind. But when 3 years were past since the sack of Nargothrond, Turambar asked Niniel again, and vowed that now he would wed her, or else go back to war in the wild. And Niniel took him with joy, and they were wedded at the midsummer, and the woodmen of Brethil made a great feast. But ere the end of the year, Glaurung sent orcs of his dominion against Brethil, and Turambar sat at home deedless, for he had promised to Niniel that he would go to battle only if their homes were assailed. But the woodmen were worsted, and Dorlas upbraided him that he would not aid the people that he had taken for his own. Then Turambar arose and brought forth again his black sword, and he gathered a great company of the men of Brethil, and they defeated the orcs utterly. But Glaurung heard tidings that the black sword was in Brethil, and he pondered what he heard, devising new evil. In the spring of the year after, Niniel conceived, and she became wan and sad. And at the same time there came to Brandir the first rumors that Glaurung had issued from Nargothrond. Then Turambar sent out scouts far afield, for now he ordered things as he would, and few gave heed to Brandir. As it drew near to summer, Glaurung came to the borders of Brethil, and lay near the west shores of Teglin. And then there was great fear among the woodfolk, for it was now plain that the great worm would assail them, and ravage their land, and not pass by, returning to Angband as they had hoped. They sought therefore the counsel of Turambar, and he counselled them that it was vain to go against Glaurung with all their force, for only by cunning and good fortune could they defeat him. He offered therefore himself to seek the dragon on the borders of the land, and bade the rest of the people to remain at Brandir, but to prepare for flight. For if Glaurung had the victory, he would come first to the woodmen's homes to destroy them, and they could not hope to withstand him. But if they then scattered far and wide, then many might escape, for Glaurung would not take up his dwelling in Brethil, and would return soon to Nargothrond. Then Turambar asked for companions willing to aid him in his peril, and Dorlas stood forth, but no others. Therefore Dorlas upbraided the people, and spoke scorn of Brandir, who could not play the part of the heir of the house of Haleth. Brandir was shamed before his people, and was bitter at heart. But Hunthor, kinsman of Brandir, asked his leave to go in his stead. Then Turambar said farewell to Niniel, and she was filled with fear and foreboding, and their parting was sorrowful. But Turambar set out with his 2 companions, and went to Nengiri. Then Niniel, being unable to endure her fear, and unwilling to wait in the Ephel tidings of Turambar's fortune, set forth after him, and a great company went with her. At this, Brandir was filled all the more with dread, and he sought to dissuade her and the people that would go with her from this rashness, but they heeded him not. Therefore he renounced his lordship and all love for the people that had scorned him, and having naught left but his love for Niniel, he girt himself with a sword and went after her, but being lame, he fell far behind. Now Turambar came to Nengirith at sundown, and there he learned that Glaurung lay on the brink of the high shores of Teglin, and was like to move when night fell. Then he called those tidings good, for the dragon lay at Kabed in Aras, where the river ran in a deep and narrow gorge that a hunted deer might overleap, and Turambar thought that he would seek no further, but would attempt to pass over the gorge. Therefore he purposed to creep down at dusk, and descend into the ravine under night, and cross over the wild water, and then to climb up the further cliff, and so come to the dragon beneath his guard. This counsel he took, but the heart of Dorlus failed when they came to the races of Teglin in the dark, and he dared not attempt the perilous crossing, but drew back and lurked in the woods, burdened with shame. Turambar and Hunthor nonetheless crossed over in safety, for the loud roaring of the water drowned all other sounds, and Glaurung slept. But ere the middle night, the dragon roused, and with a great noise and blast cast his forward part across the chasm, and began to draw his bulk after. Turambar and Hunthor were well nigh overcome by the heat and the stench, as they sought in haste for a way up to come at Glaurung. And Hunthor was slain by a great stone that was dislodged from on high by the passage of the dragon, and smote him on the head, and cast him into the river. So he ended, of the house of Halef, not the least valiant. Then Turambar summoned all his will and courage, and climbed the cliff alone, and came beneath the dragon. Then he drew Gurthang, and with all the might of his arm and of his hate, he thrust it into the soft belly of the worm, even up to the hilts. But when Glaurung felt his death pang, he screamed, and in his dreadful throe he heaved up his bulk, and hurled himself across the chasm, and there lay lashing and coiling in his agony. And he set all in a blaze about him, and beat all to ruin, until at last his fires died, and he lay still. Now Gurthang had been wrested from Turambar's hand in the throe of Glaurung, and it clave to the belly of the dragon. Turambar therefore crossed the water once more, desiring to recover his sword, and to look upon his foe. And he found him stretched at his length, and rolled upon one side, and the hilts of Gurthang stood in his belly. Then Turambar seized the hilts, and set his foot upon the belly, and cried in mockery of the dragon and his words at Nargothrond, "Hail, worm of Morgoth, well met again. Die now, and the darkness have thee." Thus is Turin, son of Húrin, avenged. Then he wrenched out the sword, but a spout of black blood followed it, and fell on his hand, and the venom burned it. And thereupon Glaurung opened his eyes, and looked upon Turambar with such malice that it smote him as a blow. And by that stroke, and the anguish of the venom, he fell into a dark swoon, and lay as one dead, and his sword was beneath him. The screams of Glaurung rang in the woods, and came to the people that waited at Nengirith. And when those that looked forth heard them, and saw afar the ruin and burning that the dragon made, they deemed that he had triumphed, and was destroying those that assailed him. Niniel sat and shuddered beside the falling water, and at the voice of